Hello and welcome back to the Big Rissue, the podcast where we're tracking the first 100 days of Rishi Sunak's premiership, seeing what he gets up to and if he delivers on any of his promises. I'm joined today by Ben Blissett, TLDR, the UK's lead writer.
Hello.
And Rory Taylor, TLDR's social media coordinator.
Hello.
How are you both doing?
Good.
I'm
Good.
doing very well.
Not
Good
long
to be
since we were
back.
last here.
No, it doesn't feel like it.
No, not at all.
We've been out of the country. You've been holding the fort.
I've been here.
You've been doing
working.
the daily briefing,
Yeah.
you've been working hard. So you're going to have to tell us what's been happening in the UK because it's
Crazy.
there's been stuff going on probably.
I mean, even though it's only been a few days since we last did this, there is actually quite a bit to talk about.
There is.
Actually,
good.
quite a bit to
Yeah.
talk about. Is a better hook at the beginning of the episode than last time.
Yeah,
So,
true.
You got some kickback in the comments last
Did
time
I?
because they were saying that you were talking down how interesting the content was, and that the audience,
I think
the people that matter, thought that there was. It was good.
I agree. I was talking it down, but I think justly so. I'm not going to dispute the fact I was talking down the importance. What is important though is a fairly major issue that Sunak is dealing with.
You're gonna get hate in the comments for using Rissue again.
I
I agree with you. You shouldn't.
There's no debate. This is a totally unnecessary sidebar. Every single episode, the first instance I say Rissue. It's always going to happen. You can't. This is the compromise.
Yeah. Okay.
I only use it twice now, and you're not going to know when the second time's coming.
Oh no.
Okay, so the first issue that Sunak's facing is in relation to kind of his general power, which is a fairly big issue to have. Obviously, Sunak has had some issues with things like housing and levelling up lately, and this has kind of seemingly undermined his power more generally and led some people to question what he's really doing in office. But kind of on those first points, on housing and levelling up, he had some big plans that didn't really go anywhere. What's the overview there? How is his power slipping specifically in that area first?
Yeah, so Sunak had a plan a couple of weeks ago to introduce a compulsory target for councils to build 300,000 new houses per year. Mm-hmm. Obviously, as we know, there's a huge housing crisis in this country. Mm-hmm. The house prices are going up at a much faster rate than income, which means that it's becoming increasingly unaffordable for people to own houses. And part of that problem is because we're just not building houses quickly enough.
Sure.
Population's growing, not enough houses. More expensive houses means fewer people owning their own homes. Mm-hmm. We know about this. This has been a problem for a number of years, and not much has happened to address it. So his plan was to introduce a new compulsory target for councils to build 300,000 new houses a year. Mm-hmm. The issue is that some of his backbenchers weren't too keen on this idea. Yeah. It had been suggested that up to 100 MPs were going to sign an amendment to change the compulsory nature of this to more of an advisory one. So certain councils could get out of building the number of houses they're required to build by saying that, for example, the houses might change the character of an area.
Which they're all going to do. Which, like, no houses would be built.
Yeah, exactly. So this sort of comes back to a sort of dispute between local residents not wanting houses to be built, because more housing in your area lowers the house price of your home because there's less demand for your house. Pretty simple economics. So they're not in favour, and also obviously while the building work's happening and everything, that's not going to be great. So, but most of the people that would be against this would presumably be in rural areas. These are areas where houses are going to be built, which are traditionally conservative areas. Hence why some backbench Tory MPs aren't in favour. Sunak this week has backed down on that and has agreed that he won't make this compulsory target. Him and the current housing minister, Michael Gove, agreed not to do this. Now, this is an indication of the fact that Sunak can't really enact policies that he thinks is important. This isn't the first time we've seen this. I'm sure we'll get into some other areas in a minute. Sure. But basically, he had a policy. Backbenchers got annoyed about it, and he just sort of backed down. And I think that this sort of demonstrates the current state of the Conservative Party, that the Prime Minister isn't able to enact his own policies because of the factional nature of the party itself.
It's interesting because this is as you say, this is clearly an objective of his. It's an important area of his broader agenda. It might not be like number one priority for him, but housing is a major issue in the UK, and he had a clear plan to kind of deal with that. And the classic, as you say, people don't want more houses because it brings down the price of their house. But everyone's in agreement that house prices are too high theoretically, but not in my area, in my village. Those houses need to stay expensive. Yeah. So it's kind of it's an ongoing issue, but it's interesting that this being a pretty important issue, especially for younger people who might not vote Conservative right now, but I don't know. Yeah, younger people. The definition of younger people not being able to buy houses is slipping up year by year, and you're eventually going to get a point when Conservatives kind of becomes an existential issue. So the fact they're not able to push this through, as you say, it's quite telling as a really important topic.
Before we move on as well, I'm sure there'll be somebody out there watching this episode who might be thinking to themselves, is housing really that big of an issue? Sure. I just want to sort of give one fact that I think is mind-blowing about the housing crisis before we move on, just to demonstrate why it's such a problem. In 1990, so about 30 years ago, the average house price was about 4 times the national median income. I think a couple of years, I don't know the exact year, but a couple of years ago, like 2018, 1920, somewhere around there, that had increased to 8 times. And in London, that's about 12-ish times. Yeah. I mean, so that takes into it. But
that's 12-ish times if you're not spending any money on anything else. Yeah. If you literally just had no cost and you just put your money aside.
That by its very nature accounts for things like inflation and everything else. That by its very nature does that. It's not just that house prices are getting more expensive because inflation happened and everything else. When you actually compare it to the national median income, it is mind-blowing how much. And that's just in 30 years.
Yeah. And this is a problem for the Conservatives specifically because home ownership has traditionally been a real kind of a moment of kind of more Tory switch. There's kind of getting married, having children, and owning your own home. All of those things notably increase your likelihood to lean towards the Conservatives. And marriage rates are dropping, birth rates are dropping, people having fewer children. And it seems that whether they want to or they don't, people are just unable to buy houses. So they're kind of the 3 major tenets of turning people Tory they've lost on, or they're losing on. The first 2, there's not a whole lot they can do about. I mean, cultural stuff, I guess, tax stuff, whatever, for kind of marriage and birth. But housing is something they could do something about, but aren't really seeming able to. Is there anything else you want to say on what this means for the Conservatives more generally? Obviously, you've said the kind of the factional nature of the party, that the Prime Minister isn't able to push through what he wants. But what else can we learn from this kind of housing debacle and kind of Sunak's lack of power?
Yeah, well, as I say, I mean, firstly, as you say, it demonstrates the factional nature. But I think that the biggest thing here is it shows that if Sunak has any solution to the big problems that people are concerned about, he can't get them through. And thirdly, I don't think it shouldn't be that much of a controversial issue. Any other government realistically shouldn't struggle too much to get their plans through, especially with the majority that Sunak has. Bear in mind, they have like a pretty decent majority currently. Yeah. It's showing that Sunak's ability to govern is being whittled down. It's also showing that he's not standing by his guns, and it also shows that his creativeness with policies, it just isn't really there. He seemed, over the summer hustings, that he had some ideas that he was going to stand by. Yeah. He actually looked, compared to Truss, quite strong on certain issues and quite ideological. Yeah. And what we're seeing now, and maybe he's been spooked by what happened to Truss, that he's just not willing to stand by those policies.
I think when you see, it was something like 100 MPs who backed that amendment that would have got rid of the mandatory housing target, like that is a real demonstration of, to him, that there's a huge part of the party that is willing to kind of go against what the government actually wants to do.
Even on issues like housing, which obviously are important, but as Ben said, ordinarily wouldn't be all that controversial. 300,000 new houses, sure, residents might not love it, but yeah, you're right. It's a worrying number for him, considering the kind of policy.
It also demonstrates that he's not willing, and this is the key point that I should have stressed more actually. He's not willing to stand by his guns. Previous governments, and Truss did this, and I think he's been spooked by this, because the thing that sort of brought Truss down was, I think the night before she resigned, there was this chaotic night in Parliament where she had what was the actual issue? She had a 3-line whip on fracking.
Yes, of course.
And people rebelled. But Sunak could have stuck by his guns and gone, no, sorry, this housing thing's important. Yeah. You will be voting with the government. I'm going to put a 3-line whip on it. Oh, it didn't even have to be 3-line. He could have just whipped. Yeah. So he could have told MPs they had to vote for it. But he knows that he doesn't have that much authority. And he's been spooked by Truss's downfall.
Also, he'd win anyway, right? 100 MPs, presumably the opposition would support the government.
But then it's not a good look. Those rebels can say you relied on Labour votes. But if I can kind of jump in to defend Rishi Sunak here, as I'm always doing.
Yeah, always, every day.
I think the government grammar school, didn't you?
No, very different. Very different.
Oh, sorry.
So I think the government argue that when they were faced with these potential rebellions on housing and also wind farms, which we might come on to, They postponed the vote. They went and talked to the so-called rebels, and they listened to them, and they changed their policy, based on that.
Yeah.
Some might say that is effective governing by listening to the wings of your party that have issues with what you're proposing. It obviously, you can frame it as, it is a U-turn, and it is conceding, but that is part of running a parliamentary party, is listening to the views of your party.
Yeah, absolutely. But you should be doing the fact that they've written the bill and that they were willing to put that forward and then spoke to people doesn't show that you're willing to listen to the bill. What that's showing is that you are worried that you're about to lose a vote and then spoke to the rebels. If you wanted to do competent governing, what you'd have done is you'd have spoken to the rebels before you drafted the bill to get their views on the bill.
I see your point, but part of the process, the bill, part of the process of putting a bill through Parliament to become law, at every stage there are changes that can be made, people that can be listened to. I appreciate this was quite late on, but I think with the wind farm thing, they also U-turned in the face of a potential rebel amendment. But that's something that actually, like, the opposition were in favour of as well. I think there is a difference when. I mean, it's obviously different because one thing is viewed as good, one thing's viewed as bad.
Sure.
But I think centrally that is part of what governing actually is listening to your parts of the party, even though, I disagree that they got rid of the mandatory housing targets, but I don't think it necessarily shows a complete lack of control.
So I would...
Because listening and changing policy is a method of control.
So there's sort of two things here. I think the first thing is that it's key that it's within their party. I would say that it going through Parliament is to get the views of other parties. And yeah, sure, it goes to committee and there's people of your own, but I think mainly it's so that you can get the whole House commenting on that. I think you should have spoken to these people before. And secondly, I think that I completely agree, but I think bills are generally tweaked as they're going through, and they're small bits that the government might not have thought about before were tweaked. I think that's a fairly fundamental part of that bill that they had to change about compulsory housing targets. If they were concerned that wasn't the right policy before, the fact that they'd written it up and it had gone through, it was about to go through Parliament, and that they then spoke to the rebels, demonstrates that they hadn't actually thought through the core elements of the bill. That isn't tweaking the bill. That is fundamentally changing it.
Do you feel equally passionately about the U-turn on onshore wind, or is it the nature of the topic?
In complete honesty, I don't know a huge amount about the onshore wind. I think that housing is a huge issue in this country. There is a housing crisis. We've covered this a number of times. So I think it's the important nature of the subject matter and the fact that it's a fundamental part of the bill, and that they should have spoken to if they were concerned that wasn't the right policy. Because of how fundamental that is, they should have done that beforehand. I totally take your point that it's right that you can change your mind, things like that. But I think with bills going through Parliament, that's tweaking it. And I think that's fine. You should be presenting as good a bill as you can at the first opportunity when it goes through. And the rest of Parliament sort of brings things through that you haven't thought about, tries to improve and gradually improve that bill as it goes through. The fundamental parts of the bill should be agreed before it goes in.
Sure. So regardless of opinion on... process, whatever. There's examples here, myriad examples of kind of backtracking, of U-turning, of whatever. And Sunak hasn't been in power that long. It feels like we've been doing this podcast for years, but it turns out it's been like a few weeks.
40 days.
But not that many days. So there's been quite a few examples of that. We've also, in those days, not seen Sunak that much publicly. The couple of times we have seen him in public are COP, where he notably U-turned on even attending, and at the speech where he kind of
the China
speech, which he also kind of U-turned on. So
and the G20 as well. I suppose he was there.
Yeah. It's a handful of times, and even the times we have seen him kind of back up the previous discussion we were having. What do we think this tells us generally? The fact that he's kind of not necessarily shying away from attention. Maybe it's a bit too soon to make that claim, but certainly not as visible and as present as Johnson was. What do we interpret?
I would say he's shying away. Okay. I think that's true. I think there's a link between his sort of legislative non-presence, the fact that he's not legislating on the things that he supposedly cares about, like housing, and the fact that he's just not present publicly.
Yeah.
And I think this all comes down to problems within the Conservative Party and the fact that he is perpetually worried about being brought down, about backbench rebellions, about people putting pressure on MPs to oust him through bad media performances. And all of these things happened to Liz Truss. Yeah. She did that absolute car crash of radio interviews, the local radio interviews, which put pressure on MPs to get rid of her. There was a load of legislative problems. Her mini budget is the prime example of her not doing that. I think that Sunak's plan at the minute is just to lay low, keep out of the headlines. Sure. Don't do anything controversial. If there's any whiff of anything going awry, drop it. Yeah. Just don't. And I think that is a very, very interesting way of governing. And I think that it has its upsides, which is that, sure, I mean, how many controversies has there really, if you consider Johnson and Truss, how many controversies actually, we bring them up and there's a couple, but this is nowhere near on the scale of
this
Liz
is controversy around policy, not around...
So
something you said.
There are elements of this working. I think it's more than fair enough to say that their plan to lay low, there are elements of that working. But as I'm sure we'll get onto, there are certainly negatives with that policy as well.
Rory, do you agree? Is he laying low?
Yeah, I think he knows that fundamentally he is a different person to Boris Johnson in that when difficult things are happening, Boris Johnson, his method, he could rely on his personality, and he would put on a high-vis jacket, go and visit somewhere, and kind of have the cameras on him. Whereas Rishi Sunak knows he can't rely on his personality, so he doesn't basically, and I think that is why he's doing it.
And Ben's obviously referenced the fact that can help sometimes. Do you think that this kind of strategy is helping the party as a whole, or is it kind of helping Labour more?
I think he's been fortunate in that there was the COP summit and the G20. So those are big things that he did go to, and he was seen and on the international stage and everything. But at home, I think it does open up a space for Labour and other opposition parties as well to kind of fill. So he has to tread a balance, really, and I'm not sure he is doing that.
I think Rory's right. I think the major side effect to this is that you create a media vacuum where there's not much happening. So if you're trying to stay out of the media have to report on something. So when Labour come out with, for example, their plans on the Constitution last week, that then gets more airtime than it usually would. Sure. And I think, honestly, if you're an opposition party, it's well known in British politics that if you're in you're the opposition party, you don't get airtime. It's really difficult for you to get onto the front pages because at the end of the day, you don't have any power. Like the media care about things because it's going to affect people and their lives.
You're talking about ideas, not things that are going to happen.
Whereas if you're talking about Labour, they don't have any power. So the demonstration last week that Labour's constitutional plans were in the news a lot. I know that you obviously do our social media, so you'll have seen this more than most. This was spoken about a lot last week. But how often does that actually happen that people talk about? And that is a direct consequence of Rishi Sunak not being present. And I think, and just one other quick thing as well, is the fact that just as a demonstration that I don't think it's unreasonable to say that he's shying away. I think that's an absolutely fair assessment. Usually you have ministers 5 days a week on the airwaves. Currently under Rishi Sunak, that's only 3 days. He's reduced that. And I think that's like a direct example of his policy of laying low. He's literally reducing the amount of interaction that journalists have with his ministers.
Yeah. Although, to be fair, I think that is a relatively new, like not new, but wasn't it? I think it's only really since the Cameron era that they've been going on the morning shows every day. So it's not a total deviation to pull back a bit and say, we don't need a minister on Good Morning Britain every day talking about the headlines. It's not really necessary. But I do see what you're saying. It's a definite step back.
A lot of this country is based on developments in convention, and that was a convention that has been developed.
It has shifted, you're right.
And I would expect that to happen. And the fact that it's been reduced, shows that he is lying low.
Yeah, and I mean, you have so many cases under Boris Johnson and Liz Truss where a minister would go on the, BBC Breakfast, Radio 4 Today programme, whatever, and say with certainty something on behalf of the government, and then a couple of hours later the government would contradict that, change their minds, do whatever. And I think they're quite scarred by that. So it would probably be quite difficult to get people out on the airwaves 5 days a week. So that's part of why they're reducing that number, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I also think that there is something to be said about the polling that the Conservatives are currently on.
Sure.
Basically, there was a YouGov poll today that put the Tories at 24% and Labour at 48%. And I think that either, there's two ways of looking at this. Him lying low is either him trying to improve those numbers because he notices that he's really far behind, and that coming out with controversial stuff and making it seem like the party's in disarray can't help polling, or the negative polling for the Conservatives is a result of the fact that they're not doing anything, that he's lying low. And that all depends on interpretation. I don't know which way around. It's like chicken and egg. I don't know which way around that is. So I don't really have a view on that. But yeah, I think that their negative polling is certainly playing into this as well.
Sure.
Yeah. I don't have anything to add to that.
No, that's fine.
Okay, so another controversy that Sunak's facing that's kind of related to all of this, but also semi-separate, is surrounding Conservative peer Michelle Mone. There's been a controversy there for a little bit. What's going to give us a broad overview, and also what's the latest?
Yeah, so Michelle Mone, she is a member of the House of Lords, Conservative member of the House of Lords. She was a businesswoman who was elevated to the Lords by David Cameron in 2015, I think.
Sure.
So the scandal is surrounding a PPE contract that the government gave to a company that she allegedly has links to.
Sure.
And I'll kind of go through that because there's so many different parts of this story. Basically, during the pandemic, the government had this VIP lane that ministers, MPs, Lords could make referrals to. They could say, put like companies through this VIP lane, so they'd get like, the government would look at those first when considering handing out contracts, and they said this was necessary because we were in, we need to act quickly. There's a company called PPE MedPro that Michelle Mone referred to the government through that VIP lane, and it was subsequently given £200 million worth of contracts to make PPE for the NHS, personal protective equipment, if anyone else is wondering. So, that's not unusual, because that's just the way the system was set up. But she is facing three kind of separate fronts on this story, basically. One, she is under a House of Lords investigation, which is basically looking into whether she has links to that company and whether she didn't declare them. However, that investigation is currently paused because the National Crime Agency are investigating the company itself for fraud. Meanwhile, or actually fairly recently, The Guardian did a report. I'm going to read this sentence very carefully because I don't want to say anything that could get me sued. The Guardian did an investigation into documents indicating that, quote, Mone and her children secretly received £29 million originating from the profits of that PPE business that was awarded large government contracts after she recommended it to ministers.
Wow.
So that's the big controversy, really, that
she got 15-ish% cut,
allegedly. He got a huge amount of money from this company, which she has said she has no involvement in. A number of times she said that. And she says she's innocent in what she's being accused for. And the latest kind of event in this story is that she has taken a leave of absence from the House of Lords so that she can clear her name. And during this time, she's also lost the Conservative whip because she's taken a leave from absence from the House of Lords. So it's pretty big stuff, and not looking great for her, considering how many different angles there are to it.
I mean, when your scandal is three-pronged, you've messed up.
Yeah, exactly.
What's Labour's response to this been? Obviously, she's been a Conservative, so there's some there's a Rissue for Sunak there. So
there it is. So Labour, they've kind of been criticising the government's VIP contract system for a while now, but specifically on this, they forced a vote in the House of Commons through what is called a humble address, which is a way that the opposition can seek or can kind of force the government into releasing documents about certain things. So they tried to do that to get the government to release documents on this contract. The government, when Labour kind of announced this plan, the government were fairly quick in saying, actually, we're not going to vote down this plan, this request from Labour. So Labour's motion to get these documents released passed, so the government have committed to releasing the documents. So, there was almost like a setup for a big parliamentary battle, but I think it was quite clear that the government were thinking, hang on, we've had these kind of things before with Owen Paterson, and the other scandals under Boris Johnson. We don't want to have this vote where people can say government voted against the release of this information while the other parties are trying to be transparent about it. They just gave in pretty quickly. So at some point we'll get those documents.
That'll be interesting.
But it's also, in terms of Rishi Sunak, if I should bring it back to Rishi himself.
The big man.
When I think the first Prime Minister's questions after that Guardian report came out, he said he was shocked to read it, and he also said that it's right that she's taken a leave from the House of Lords, but that the process that is, kind of ongoing should be allowed to finich. So he's very much like, he's not trying to defend her, basically.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think he's trying to keep this as, do the exact opposite of what Boris Johnson might have done, basically.
Yeah.
Don't try and fight it. Let the process happen. Condemn, what you know, and then see what happens.
It seems to just be another episode in the long saga of dodgy BPE contracts.
Yeah.
And I totally understand why there needed to be a relaxation of the rules in 2020 when we needed PPE and there wasn't time to vet each thing. I think that's relatively standard, but that's fair enough. I think not many people would take issue there. But if you're going to do that and relax, there should be some level of accountability for that. There should be some level of trust. And it's just another example of it being broken. It's just another example of it being taken advantage of in an emergency situation.
Yeah, and I think as we get further away from the kind of peak pandemic, we're going to continue having these stories, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow. It'll be interesting to see what happens. This could be a big issue for Rishi. And one of a number of bigger and growing issues as they kind of culminate and as he continues to hide. We'll see whether he's still hiding over the weekend. See if he gets up to something. He could have a big weekend plan.
Do you think things will get quieter over Christmas, news-wise?
Probably.
Usually they
normally
feel
do.
like they do, but anything can happen, can't it?
I think it's just because we've had pandemic the last couple of years. We've also had Brexit happening over Christmas.
We've had a treat.
Yeah.
Christmas treat many years.
I think
pandemic wasn't a treat, actually. I take that back. And nor was Brexit. Really. It's kind
we
of
haven't had
horrible.
any Christmas treats.
I think it's
Give
going
us
to
a
be really
Christmas
quiet.
treat. Come on. What can he announce as a treat?
I know. Money.
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 As
You
a
can
creative...
stand
Cost
outside
of
number
living
10 and say,
payments.
"Are you ready for Christmas?" Like Theresa May did.
Are you ready for Christmas?
Can we cut that clip in now? I don't know if we have that technical ability.
Are you all looking forward to Christmas? Are you all looking forward to Christmas?
Lovely.
Thank you. Wow,
That's
what
a really
clip.
funny clip.
Yeah, very nice.
Very good.
And on that very funny note, that's all we have time for today. I've been your host, Jack Kelly. I've been joined by Ben Blissett and Rory Taylor. This episode was produced by Jan Azamic and edited by Scarlett Watchorn. This has been a TLDR News production for 326 Limited.
It may well have been edited by Ben Blissett.
Oh, twist.
Shout out.
Shout out.
What a lad. No.
I'm off. Not having that. Ready to go?
Wow, what energy.
Woo!